War leaves marks that never heal. Some are written in archives, others in the soil that swallows what history forgets. Every battlefield has two stories, the one that makes it to the reports, and the one whispered by the ground, long after the last shot is fired. Tonight, we open one of those forgotten pages, a tale that began with soldiers on routine training and ended with the world learning that memory itself can move. These are not stories about monsters. They are about what remains when men become echoes and the earth decides to remember them. Close your eyes. Listen to the sound between the static, the breath between orders. What you are about to hear is taken from voices found on lost recordings, written by hands that never returned. This is a war story told in the dark, one where fear and recognition share the same name, one that reminds us that sometimes, when the radios go silent, the field keeps talking back. Now, let the signal play. When I first joined the Marine Corps, everything about the field felt like a foreign planet. The smell of fuel, wet canvas, and sweat hung in the air thicker than the fog that crawled down from the California mountains. At the Mountain Warfare Training Center near Bridgeport, they told us this was where Marines learned to survive when the world itself wanted them gone. The wind howled through the pine like something alive, and the cold bit through every layer of gear we owned. We were told to keep quiet after dark. Out there, sound carried like a confession. My name was Oscar back then, just another young corporal with more courage than sense. We had been in the high altitude for 2 days, waiting for our bodies to stop fighting the thin air. Nights were the worst. You could hear your own pulse echoing through your helmet, while the mountains groaned somewhere far off. That evening, when the sky turned black and the snow began to drift, my team crawled under the tarps we had rigged between a tree and a wall of rock. It was supposed to be a simple night sleep, guard shift, then patrol again at dawn. Around 9 that night, I drifted between waking and sleep when a sharp metallic sound snapped through the stillness. It was the unmistakable clack of a rifle being charged. Every hair on my arms rose. In that cold silence, even a breath sounded like a shout, and this was loud enough to wake the dead. My first thought was that one of my engineers was cleaning his weapon, careless and tired. But when I glanced over, both of their rifles were on the ground beside them, untouched. The only one missing was the water dog's weapon, hidden behind the tree near the rock face. I whispered his name. No answer. Then again, louder. His sleeping bag moved and his head appeared. He swore it wasn't him. The sound had come from the other side of the tarp, the dark side pressed against the mountain. For a long moment, we just listened. Wind hissed over the ridge. Snow tapped against the tarp like fingertips. Somewhere beyond that thin sheet of fabric, something waited without breathing. I pulled my knife free and crawled out into the cold. My breath turned white in the air. The light from my headlamp carved narrow tunnels through the mist, showing only rocks and frozen earth. Nothing moved. Behind me, our sergeant's voice cut the dark, low and irritated, asking what the hell I was doing. I told him about the sound. He had heard it too. He thought one of us had been messing around, maybe trying to spook the others. But when he checked with the fire watch posted a few yards away, they swore nobody had touched their rifles. The sergeant came back, shaking his head, his voice quieter now. Go back to sleep, he said. This place gets in your head. I crawled back under the tarp. My heartbeat refused to settle. For a long while, the wind carried strange notes that almost sounded like movement, like someone testing the weight of each step above us, on the rock. Then even that stopped. When I woke again, pale morning light seeped through the tarp. Everything around us was wrong. The tarps were ripped down. The stakes were gone. The small boulders we had used to anchor the corners had vanished as if the earth had swallowed them. My sergeant was already up, his face pale against the gray dawn. He said nothing at first, then finally told us what he had seen after sending me back to sleep. He said something had been perched on the rock face behind us, high above the ground. A shape like a human, naked and hairless, crouched against the stone. Its eyes glowed in the dark like glass catching firelight. The instant he saw it, the thing ducked out of sight. He had tried to convince himself it was exhaustion, a trick of the thin air and the altitude. But now, with our camp torn apart, he wasn't sure. None of us were. As we packed up the shredded tarps, the tree still bore marks that looked too even to be natural thin grooves, pressed deep into the bark, like something had gripped it with long fingers. The others avoided looking at them. We told ourselves it was the wind, or maybe a curious animal. But no one said what we were all thinking. Something had touched our camp in the night, and it was not human. We left the site in silence. The snow had already covered our tracks. The wind carried the sound of the branches shifting high above us, and once, just once, I thought I heard something moving in rhythm with our footsteps. I never looked up to check. The wind that morning refused to calm. It scraped across the mountain like tasty paper, carrying the sour smell of melting snow and burnt diesel from the stoves below. No one spoke. We packed in silence, each man pretending the night before had not happened. But silence in the field was never empty. It had weight. It pressed on your chest until you breathed faster just to prove you were still alive. By midday, our squad pushed toward a new landing zone higher up the ridge. The sergeant's voice was clipped, businesslike, avoiding the edge of fear that hid in his tone. "LZ Owl," he said. We set up, eat, sleep, move again at first light. The others nodded. Orders made things feel normal, and normal was something we all needed. The sun sank behind a curtain of fog before we reached the site. Trees leaned inward, their branches heavy with frost. The rock wall that marked the landing zone rose steep and silent, a gray sheet towering above us. When the last light died, we strung our tarps again, tighter this time. Every corner, double secured. No one joked, no one hummed. The cold chewed through our gloves, and the night came early, thick and soundless. It began the same way. A faint crack, like a twig under weight. Then another, higher up. The sergeant froze, his hand raised. My breath fogged the air between us. From the slope behind the tree, a small shower of pebbles trickled down, landing near my boots. Every man turned his light upward. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then we saw it. Perched halfway up the rock face, something crouched. It clung to the stone with a grace that defied sense, pale and long-limbed. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The reflection of our lights caught its eyes, two dull coins glowing back at us. It did not fly. Neither did we. The sound of my pulse filled my ears, louder than the wind. The sergeant whispered for everyone to stand down, to lower the lights, but no one obeyed. We watched as the shape twitched, like it was deciding whether to climb higher or come down. Then, without a sound, it melted backward into the dark, swallowed by the stone itself. The cliff returned to stillness. The snow resumed falling, small and steady. After a long pause, the sergeant ordered lights off and voices low. He said what leaders always say when logic has no answers. Altitude plays tricks on the eyes. But when I lay back under the tarp, I could still see those eyes, burning faintly in the dark behind my lids. Hours passed. I thought I had drifted to sleep when a weight pressed gently on the edge of my tarp. It bowed inward, slow, deliberate, like a hand testing the material. I held my breath. The pressure stayed for a full minute, then vanished. Snow sifted down from the tree above, as if brushed by something moving past. At dawn, the tarps held, but a single line had been cut clean through one corner, as if with a blade. The sergeant said nothing about it during breakfast. We finished our rations fast and prepared to move out. When I turned back toward the cliff, light crept down the rock and revealed fresh scratches where the creature had been. They formed a pattern, almost a handprint, fingers splayed too far apart for any human. We left that site in formation. The others laughed again, pretending they weren't afraid. I tried to join in, but the sound that came out of me was thin and hollow. Deep down, we all knew the truth. Something watched us through the fog, learning how we swayed, how we breathed, how we slept. That night, the mountains would speak again. And this time, it would not be satisfied with watching. Morning rose dull and pale, the kind of light that offered no warmth, only the reminder that the night was finally over. Frost covered everything, the tarps, the rifles, even the canteens that clinked like glass when we moved them. No one had slept. Every face around me looked drawn tight, eyes ringed in red. The sergeant spoke in a low tone, his words simple, meant to keep us from thinking too much. Pack up, check gear, move out. Routine was armor, but the ground beneath that routine felt cracked. When I reached for my tarp, the fabric came away in my hands, torn down the middle. The line that had been sliced the night before now split entirely, as though something had worried at it in the dark. One of the engineers found his sleeping bag dragged 3 feet from where he had left it. No tracks led to it or away. The sergeant's jaw clenched. He called it a prank, though his voice lacked conviction. He said maybe the wind had worked loose the tarps. Maybe we were all seeing things. But the wind did not pull stakes from frozen ground, or carry rocks that weighed more than a man's helmet. The word maybe hung in the air like a lie we all agreed to repeat. We moved out by mid-morning, climbing down toward lower ground, where the snow thinned. The trail wound through clusters of black pines, each one whispering in the wind. The air smelled metallic, sharp, the way it does after lightning. I kept my eyes forward, yet every few minutes I caught movement at the edge of my vision, a flicker between trees, a ripple where the fog thickened. By afternoon, we reached the supply checkpoint. A radio operator from another unit stood waiting. He had a rumor to share, the kind that spreads fast when men are tired. He said a patrol from the animal packer course had gone missing overnight. Their horses had come back without them. No one spoke. The sergeant told him to keep quiet about it, then turned away too quickly. That night, at the lower camp, laughter returned, thin and forced. The cook told stories about old myths from the mountains, about miners who vanished into crevices that were not on any map. He called them borrowed souls. I pretended to laugh, though my mind kept circling back to the eyes on the cliff. Every time I blinked, I saw the faint glow reflected in the snow. Before lights out, I checked the rifles. All of them were fine. Bolts locked. Safeties on. Still, I placed mine across my chest when I lay down, a habit I had never needed before. Around midnight, the wind picked up, carrying the sound of the forest bending. The tarp above me rattled, then went still. Somewhere to my left, a voice muttered in sleep, followed by the slow scrape of fabric against the dawn. I waited, breath held, until the noise faded. Maybe it was just a dream. Maybe not. When dawn came, there was a single print outside my tarp, pressed deep into the frozen soil. It was shaped like a hand, but longer, the fingers curling slightly inward, each tip marked by a faint groove, as though the creature had claws made of bone. We covered the print before anyone else could see it. The sergeant pretended not to notice what we were doing. His silence was permission. He wanted the same thing we did, to pretend that if we ignored it, the mountains would give us bivouac, our sense of safety. But safety was already gone. As we broke camp, A gust of wind rolled down the ridge, carrying with it a sound that froze us in place. It was faint, stretched thin by distance, but it was a voice. Not an animal, not the wind. A voice, human and not human, whispering through the trees in a tone that seemed to know each of our names. I turned toward the sound. Nothing moved, just the endless sweep of white hills and dark timber. But deep inside of that quiet, something was listening back. The following morning felt stranger than the night before, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over the ridges. The mist refused to burn away, clinging to the ground like a living thing. We hiked through it in silence, each man caught in his own thoughts. The radio crackled now and then, bursts of static that made us flinch more than unearth ever had. The mountain had changed us in small ways already. We spoke less, slept light, and listened to every gust of wind as if it carried intent. At midday, we reached a flat overlook where the fog thinned just enough to see the valley below. One of the engineers took out a camera, something personal he kept hidden from inspection, and said he wanted proof of how miserable the place looked. He snapped pictures of the cliffs, of our camp, of us standing in the cold trying to smile. The film advanced with a dry click that seemed too loud. When we developed the shots that evening at lower base, one frame came out wrong. The mist in it was thicker, rolling across the rocks like smoke. Near the edge of the frame, a shape was climbing. Long arms, pale skin stretched tight. No face, just a smear where eyes should have been. The engineer swore he hadn't seen anyone there when he took it. The sergeant took the photo, studied it a moment, then tore it in half. He told us to forget it. For the rest of that day, unease spread through the camp like a virus. Men from other units whispered that Bridgeport had a history, that soldiers had vanished here before, their tracks ending at sheer cliffs. The higher command brushed it off as weather and exhaustion. Officially, nothing had ever happened. But at night, when the wind carried distant noises that sounded too human, those denials meant nothing. One of the water specialists, the same one who loved to show off his bayonet, began talking about skinwalkers and ghost stories from his skinfalfulary. He said mountains remember things, and sometimes the dead learn to walk again, in the forms of what killed them. The rest of us laughed, but it was a nervous kind of laughter. He slept with his rifle across his chest that night. When I stepped out for fire watch, the fog had returned, thicker than before. The world ended 10 feet from where I stood. Beyond that, only white. Then faintly through the veil, movement. Not fast and not bold, just something shifting, adjusting its weight. I raised my light. The beam dissolved in the mist, showing only the shape of a tree and the echo of my own fear. Still, I knew I wasn't alone. Hours later, back under my tarp, I could hear distant talking from another group. Their voices tight, hurried. Someone said they had seen lights on the ridge that weren't ours, small, bluish, flickering as if someone was signaling. When we checked in the morning, there were no footprints on that slope, only a line of disturbed snow that led to the cliff and stopped at its edge. The sergeant tried to make a report. Higher command told him to focus on the mission. He stopped trying after that. Orders kept us moving, but none of us could shake the feeling that we were being herded toward something. By evening, the fog thickened again. The air felt heavier, almost electric. We were told to stay put for the night. No patrols, no unnecessary movement. As I zipped my sleeping bag, I glanced toward the tree line. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw the reflection of eye small, round and low, to the ground watching from the mist. Then they blinked out, leaving only the slow breath of wind moving through the needles. I closed my eyes, pretending sleep would keep the world outside. Somewhere beyond the tarps, something exhaled, long and deliberate, as though trying to remember how humans breathe. Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. The air there carried the smell of pine resin and damp earth, different from the metallic sting of the California mountains, but no less heavy. The training area stretched wide, a patchwork of prairies and deep forest broken by narrow trails. For a guardsman, it was supposed to be routine: night land navigation, compass work, point plotting, nothing dramatic. Yet from the first step into those woods, I felt the same kind of quiet that makes the mind invent its own company. I had plotted my points carefully that evening, using a red lens on my headlamp to keep my eyes adjusted. The map felt slick in my gloves, the compass needle trembling as if caught in some hidden current. Every few yards, a twig snapped underfoot, echoing too sharply through the trees. The wind barely moved. Even the owls had gone silent. The training manual said to travel alone during night navigation, to rely on instinct and bearings. Out there alone, instinct did its own talking. I moved slow, counting steps, turning angles, trying not to let my imagination fill the shadows with faces. The moon was bright, but kept hiding behind fast-moving clouds, giving and taking light in uneven breaths. After an hour, I reached a clearing where prairie met forest. The land dipped slightly, and in the center stood a tree that had split in half years ago, its trunk jagged like a broken rib. On the higher half, about 15 feet above ground, something clung to the wood. At first I thought it was another soldier checking his bearings, until the figure shifted, bending too far backward, head cocked toward me, in a way no human spine could manage. "Hey," I called, keeping my voice steady. "You stuck up there?" The thing twitched. Moonlight slid out from behind the clouds, spilling across its body. What I saw made my skin crawl. It was thin, almost translucent, the shape of a person stretched too lightly. Its face was smooth, featureless, except for 2 small indentations where eyes should have been. It turned fully toward me, its limbs tightening against the bark. I froze. My mind searched for protocol, but the handbook had nothing for this. Then it moved. It scurried down the trunk like a spider, hands and feet finding purchase in places that should have been impossible. I reached for my light instinctively, fumbling through the cycle off, flashing red, white until finally a white beam cut through the dark. For a single heartbeat, the light caught it at the edge of the clearing, hunched on all 4 of its heads tilted toward me. Then it vanished into the brush with a scraping sound that echoed in my chest. I listened for pursuit. None came, only the rustle of branches settling back into place. My legs felt unsteady, but I forced them to move, angling away from where it had gone. The route back to the main road should have been easy 10 minutes of walking through moderate woodland, but every tree looked the same, and the compass needle refused to settle. When I glanced up again, I saw the tree I had just left standing behind me. Somehow, I had circled back. That was when the smell reached me, sharp and sweet, like copper and wet moss. I turned the light slowly, sweeping the forest floor. Nothing. Then higher up, between the branches, 2 pale ovals hovered, catching the beam before slipping out of sight. My heart pounded against the layers of my uniform. I wanted to call out, to demand it show itself, but the word caught in my throat. Something in me knew the forest would answer if I spoke. I took 1 step backward, then another, never breaking my gaze from the shadows. Finally, I turned and ran. Branches whipped my arms, tearing at my sleeves. Behind me, faint and rhythmic, came the sound of hands striking wood, climbing. Not chasing, but cozy. When the tree line broke and gravel crunched beneath my boots, I saw the lights of the training vehicles in the distance and ran harder. When I reached the road, the night went quiet again. Too quickly as if the forest itself had exhaled and gone still. I told no one what I had seen. Officers were supposed to lead by logic, not fear. Yet as I stood catching my breath under the pale moon, I could still feel those eyes somewhere above, following me from the canopy, waiting for the dark to swallow me again. Snow began again before dusk, soft at first, then thick enough to turn the ridgeline into a white blur. The storm muffled everything: boots, breath, even the metallic clink of gear. It was almost peaceful until we reached the clearing where our tarps had been shredded 2 nights before. The place looked unchanged, except for the tree. The bark where we had seen the marks was now stripped clean, as if someone had taken a knife to it. The sergeant ordered a short halt. We needed to check the ground for signs of animal movement, or so he said. None of us believed that was why we had stopped. The air was still, heavy, waiting. When we brushed the snow aside, we found impressions in the frozen soil. Not quite footprints, not quite handprints, something between the two, long-fingered and narrow, pressed deep, as if made by a creature far heavier than its size should allow. No one spoke. The sergeant crouched, touched the edge of one print with his glove, and pulled back quickly, muttering about frostbite. But I saw his hand trembling. He stood, told us to move out, then changed his mind and told us to circle the area. "I want to know if anyone's screwing with us," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. We split into pairs, each man moving to a different quadrant. My partner, the same water specialist who liked to brag about his bayonet, stayed silent for once. Every few minutes, he glanced upward, scanning the trees. The storm had eased into a fine drift, enough that shapes flickered through the veil of white. Once, I thought I saw movementa blur between 2 rocks, but when I turned my light there, nothing remained except falling snow. When we regrouped, the sergeant looked older, his expression carved from stone. "We're setting a perimeter," he said. "Trip lines, markers, anything we have." We didn't question it. Fear had become procedure. We worked in silence until the light faded completely. The lines went up, stretching thin threads of wire between the trees, hanging cans and small pieces of metal, to rattle if disturbed. Primitive, but better than nothing. After chow, the sergeant gathered us under a lean-to made from spare tarps. He spoke quietly, the wind barely carrying his words. "Altitude does things," he said. "Dehydration, lack of sleep, stress. You start hearing noises that aren't there." Then his eyes met mine, sharp and uneasy. "But prints don't imagine themselves." He told us to keep watch in shifts and to record any sound, no matter how small. That night, the forest held its breath. The only sound came from the slow drift of snow landing on nylon. Then, faintly, the cans along the northern line clinked once. We froze. Another clink farther away. The sergeant motioned to hold. A third sound came, a slow, deliberate drag, as though something heavy was moving on all fours, testing the traps. We waited. Minutes stretched then. The wind picked up again, covering everything in white noise. The sound stopped. The sergeant whispered to relax, that it might have been a deer. But even deer leave tracks. When dawn arrived, we checked the lines. Every can still hung where we had left it. The snow beneath them was smooth, untouched. Only one thing had changed. Near the edge of the camp, beside the tree where we had tied the last wire, a shape had been traced into the snow. Not carved, not stamped. Drawn with careful lines, the way a child might sketch with a stick. It was a crude outline of a human face, elongated, eyeless. The snow inside the drawing had melted slightly, as though someone's warm hand had lingered there too long. The sergeant stared at it, then brushed it away with his boot. "Pack up," he said, his voice almost gentle. "We're leaving this position." As we moved out, I looked back once more. The wind had already begun to erase our prints, but faintly near the tree line. I could see new impressions forming. They were too evenly spaced to be random. too deliberate to be the wind. It was following us again, step for step, patient as the snow. The forest in Wisconsin was quieter than any I had ever known. It was not the kind of quiet that soothed. It pressed in, thick and expectant, as though the trees were listening for a message. I had completed my plotted points for the night, the compass needle steady now that the clouds had cleared. I should have headed back. The map said the road was a short walk east, yet something in me refused to move toward safety. The clearing where I had seen the figures still called to me, a knot of curiosity and disbelief I could not untie. I told myself I only wanted to confirm the tree, to prove that it had looked stranger in moonlight than it really was. When I reached it again, the stump glowed faintly under the cold reflection of the moon. The marks on the bark were deep, gouged in patterns that looked deliberate, almost like symbols. I leaned closer, tracing them with my glove. The grooves were smooth, too clean for claws, too random for a knife. Behind me, snow cracked. Not loudly, but sharp enough that instinct turned me around before thought could form. My light swept across empty ground. The air smelled faintly sweet, metallic and weighty. I waited, pulse loud in my ears, but nothing followed. I forced a laugh, short and brittle, and began to step away when a sound answered the crunch of my boot. A second footfall, perfectly in rhythm with mine. I froze again. The sound froze too. The forest seemed to lean closer. I turned off the light and stood in darkness, listening. At first only silence, then a whisper of movement above, as if something shifted its weight on a branch. I looked up. Between the limbs, the stars blinked, clear and sharp. One of them moved. It wasn't a star. It was an eye reflecting pale light, wide and still. Then another beside it. The shape that held them crouched against the trunk, almost invisible, except for the shimmer of skin catching the moon. It was higher than I could throw a rock, yet close enough that I could feel it watching. I didn't move. Neither did it. After what felt like an hour, but could have been a minute. The thing blinked, or maybe the clouds passed over, dimming the light, and when sight returned, the branch was empty. The silence that followed was worse than noise. I started walking again, this time toward the road, forcing each step to sound steady. The second set of footsteps returned, matching mine. Not closer, not farther, just there. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, sweat ran cold under my uniform. The road stretched empty ahead. I thought about turning on the radio, but what would I say? There's something out here that moves like me. No one would believe it. So I walked faster, pretending the steady rhythm of boots on gravel was mine alone. When I reached the first checkpoint, one of the instructors leaned out of a vehicle window and laughed at the sight of me. "You look like you saw a ghost," he said. I smiled back, because that was easier than explaining. I told him I got lost, missed a landmark, nothing more. He waved me off, told me to grab chow. As I walked past the headlights, I caught my reflection in the glass of a parked truck. Behind my shoulder, just at the line where the darkness met the light, something pale flickered out of view. That night, in the barracks, I dreamed of the forest moving, trees bending toward a point I couldn't see, the sound of something breathing not through lungs, but through the earth itself. When I woke, my boots were wet, as though I had walked through snow. The next morning, I inspected the clearing again in daylight, half expecting to find the place ordinary, stripped of its menace. The stump was still there, the marks deeper now, and beside it, a faint impression in the soil, shaped like a hand with fingers too long to belong to any man. I brushed it away before the others arrived. Some truths were easier to carry alone. Sleep had become a luxury none of us could afford, yet it claimed us anyway, stealing hours in broken fragments. That night, I dreamed of the ridge again, but it was not the same ridge. The snow glowed green like glass, and someone stood on the far side, waving for me to follow. It was a face I knew, Corporal Henders, one of our engineers who had transferred out weeks before. His smile looked wrong, stretched thin, too many teeth showing. He said my name softly, the way a friend does when trying not to wake another. Then his mouth kept moving after the words stopped. The sound that came out was the grind of rocks shifting under ice. I woke gasping, my breath clouding the air. The fire had gone out. Around me, everyone slept still, each man locked inside his own uneasy dream. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside. The snow had fallen all night. It covered the wires we had strung for alarms, buried the tracks we left, smoothed every edge. The mountains looked clean, almost beautiful. I almost convinced myself that it had all been a bad run of nerves. Then I saw them prints leading away from camp. 5 impressions, spaced wide, light enough that the snow barely sagged beneath them. They were not boot prints. I followed them until they vanished into a cluster of fir trees. The silence there was total. No birds, no creak of branches, only my own pulse. Then a smell drifted down, faint but distinct. Sweat, metal, and something like burned hair. I looked up. Something pale shifted among the limbs high above, too large to be a bird, too small to be a man. When I blinked, it was gone. Back at camp, the others were stirring. The sergeant noticed me first. "You look like you saw a ghost," he said, using the same joke soldiers have used for centuries to make fear manageable. I told him I thought I saw tracks from a coyote. He nodded, not believing, but not pressing. There was an understanding now between all of us. Truth could only make things worse. Later that afternoon, a radio message came through. A training team operating near the upper ridges had reported a man missing during a patrol. No distress signal, no footprints leading away. The last time anyone had seen him was before nightfall, setting up a perimeter near the cliffs. His name was Henders, the same man from my dream. The sergeant's face hardened as he read the report. "Altitude takes men," he said flatly. "That's all." We nodded, because that was what you did when the only other explanation was madness. Still, when night fell again, none of us could bring ourselves to sleep. The tarps whispered in the wind, the same rhythm as breathing. Around midnight, I heard movement near the supply crates. I crawled out and saw the water specialist standing motionless, staring toward the dark slope above the camp. His bayonet glinted in the faint light. I asked what he saw. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Someone's calling me from up there." I listened. The air was still. No voice carried through the trees. But he kept staring, mouth slightly open, as though hearing something just beyond my range. I told him to step back, but he didn't move. Then he whispered, "It's Henders." By morning, we found his sleeping bag empty. His rifle leaned neatly against the tree, untouched. The snow around it was smooth. No footprints led away. Only a set of faint drag lines that ended halfway up the rock face. The sergeant called it desertion on the report. The rest of us knew better. Whatever haunted those slopes was learning. It had taken one of us before, and now it had returned for another. When the sun rose, we broke camp. As we climbed, the wind carried a low sound between the cliff, half whistle, half voice, drawing our names through the static of the cold. I told myself it was just the wind shaping the air. But a part of me, the part that still saw Henders in my dreams, knew he was calling again, asking us to follow him into the white. The loss of the water specialist changed everything. We stopped joking. Orders became shorter, sharper, without the padding of humor that used to make them bearable. The sergeant spoke little now. His voice carried the weight of something he no longer believed in. That morning, he called me aside and said we were staying another night. He wanted proof of what stalked us, even if it meant risking another disappearance. Our training was in engineering. We built bridges and fortifications. Setting traps was not foreign to us, though the thought of needing them here felt wrong. Still, we worked through the afternoon, rigging lines of wire between trees, planting motion flares scavenged from old supply kits. We set rocks in precarious stacks, ready to fall and trigger sound. Every man had a sector to watch. The plan looked neat on paper, fragile against the reality of what we faced. When night came, the mountain turned glassy under the moon. The snow reflected enough light to see without lamps, but that only made every shadow seem alive. I could hear my own breath inside the mask of my scarf, the soft rasp of fabric against skin. Nothing moved. The traps waited. An hour passed, then two. The saline stretched so long that I began to believe we had frightened it away, whatever it was. Then came the first sound, soft metallic click. One of our flares arming itself without trigger. A line of light flashed deep in the woods, vanished. Then another flared briefly on the opposite side. The sergeant whispered for everyone to hold positions. His face was pale in the ghostly light. Then, nothing. The traps stood untouched. The wires hung still. Yet the feeling of being surrounded grew thick enough to must-80. I could hear something moving between the trees, slow and deliberate. Never breaking a branch. Never stepping wrong. The air grew colder, the way it does before lightning strikes. When the sound reached the nearest line, the rocks we had stacked began to slide one by one, toppling too slowly to be caused by wind. They fell in a pattern, deliberate, tracing a half circle around the camp. It was like watching a map draw itself. The sergeant hissed for us to stay still. No one breathed. Then one of the motion flares ignited, bathing the clearing in pale red light. For the briefest moment, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, moving just beyond the edge of the light. Its limbs seemed jointed wrong, bending where they shouldn't. The head tilted, not curious, but calculating. It stepped backward into darkness, and the light sputtered out. The sergeant cursed under his breath and ordered us to check the lines at first light. Until then, no movement, no sound. We obeyed. The hours crawled by, the wind whispering through the wires like distant voices. Sometime near dawn, I drifted into a half-sleep and dreamed I was buried in snow, hearing footsteps overhead that matched the rhythm of my heart. When the ski turned gray, we moved out to inspect the traps. Not one was sprung. The wires lay intact, the rocks untouched. Except for the snow around them swept clean in perfect circles, as though something had studied the device and moved carefully around each one. The only disturbance was near the fire pit, where the ashes had been rearranged into a shape none of us recognized. A spiral of overlapping lines, too precise to be random. The sergeant said nothing. He crushed the pattern with his boot and told us to pack. His silence was heavier than any order. As we moved out, I looked back once more at the clearing. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure crouched beside the tree line, tracing fresh marks into the snow. But when I blinked, the shape dissolved, leaving only wind-blown powder. We left that place behind, but it followed in ways we couldn't measure. Every echo, every creak of the pack straps, every whisper of snow sliding from a branch became suspect. I began to understand that we were not simply being hunted. We were being taught to listen, to wait, to fear. That night, I dreamed of the traps again. They weren't meant to catch the creature. They were meant to map us, each thread of wire marking the shape of our fear, so it could learn where to step next. The forest looked harmless in daylight, a tangle of pale trunks and frostbitten grass. But when the sun fell and the moon climbed, it turned into something else entirely, a labyrinth of sound and shadow, where every tree leaned inward, as if listening. The night I went back to finish my land navigation course, I told myself I was prepared. I had retraced the map twice, memorized each grid, marked the compass points until they were burned into my thoughts. There was no reason to fear. Still, when I stepped off the road and into the tree line, the quiet returned like a memory. The snow here was thin, packed hard by years of use, yet it muffled my boots. The air smelled clean, sharp, until it didn't. Halfway to my first point, I caught the faint odor again, copper and wet moss. The same scent I had noticed near the broken tree days before. I turned on my red light, letting it sweep the trunks in wide arcs. The forest stood motionless. I moved faster now, checking the compass every few steps. When I reached the next coordinate marker, the wind shifted. Behind me, a branch creaked. I froze, counting to 3. Nothing. Then another creaked closer. The noise wasn't random. It came in intervals, almost matching the rhythm of my breath. I shut off the light and knelt low, waiting. The world compressed into sound, the pulse in my ears, the shallow crunch of snow settling. Then, from somewhere above, a soft pop of breaking wood. My eyes lifted automatically. Against the dim sky, something hung from the limb of a tree, pale shape, long-limbed, moving with eerie control. For a moment, it looked almost human. Then it unfolded itself, dropping silently to the ground. The shock froze me for a heartbeat too long. When I finally moved, instinct took over. I turned and ran. My headlamp swung wildly, throwing frantic beams through the trees. Behind me came the faint patter of movement, lighter than footsteps, but fast. Every muscle screamed for more speed. I crashed through brush, stumbling over roots, gasping air that burned my throat. The road wasn't far. I knew that if I kept north, I would hit it within minutes. Yet the forest seemed endless. I tripped once, hit the ground hard, and rolled onto my back. My light caught the thing mid-stride. It was taller than I had thought, hunched low, its hand touching the ground like a bound pair of legs. Its face, or what passed for one, was smooth, featureless, except for the slightest indentation, where eyes might hide. It didn't breathe. It simply waited, crouched as if studying whether I was worth the effort. I scrambled up and ran again. Branches tore at my sleeves. Somewhere behind me, the sound shifted from footsteps to scraping, as if claws raked along bark. The clearing appeared suddenly, the snow there bright under the moon. I pushed through, lungs burning, and reached the opposite edge. When I risked a glance back, the clearing stood empty. Only the trees swayed, whispering to each other. Then came a sound from above, the crack of wood bending. I looked up just in time to see the thing leap, landing silently on the trunk beside me, halfway between earth and sky. It clung there, head turned sideways, studying me. I lifted my knife without thinking, though I knew the gesture meant nothing. Its head tilted farther, almost curious. Then, just as sudden, it retreated into darkness, vanishing into the canopy. I stood there shaking, blade useless in my hand. When I finally moved again, I didn't stop until the gravel of the road crunched under my boots. The headlights of parked vehicles gleamed faintly through the fog. No one believed me when I returned to camp. I didn't try to convince them. I said I had lost my bearings, tripped on a route, and scared myself with shadows. The sergeant chuckled and called me rookie. But that night, as I lay in my bunk, I saw the clearing again behind my eyes. The moonlight had been clear enough to leave an imprint. I remembered how its skin had caught the light, not pale like snow, but translucent, as if something moved beneath the surface, twisting and pulsing slow as breath. I realized it hadn't chased me to kill. It had followed to see how far I would run. And now it knew the distance. The morning after the second disappearance, The mountain seemed to hold its breath. The wind had died, and with it, the usual chatter of branches and snow. The silence pressed down harder than any storm. We packed up, not because we were ordered to, but because staying still felt like an invitation. Every motion was deliberate, slow, quiet. The sergeant's eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, his jaw clenched so tight I could hear it pop when he gave commands. We reached the lower base by late afternoon, a small collection of tents and prefab huts half buried under frost. The first thing he did was march straight to the communications trailer. I followed. Inside, the heat felt wrong, too sudden after the cold. He filled out an incident report on a clipboard, his handwriting shaking. 2 missing personnel, he wrote. Possible environmental disorientation. Unconfirmed visual anomalies. He hesitated before the last phrase, pressing his pen hard enough to tear the paper. When he finished, he handed the sheet to the duty officer, a young lieutenant, with a face too smooth for the field. The lieutenant skimmed the page, frowned, and then asked, "Was there hostile contact?" The sergeant said no. "Then this isn't combat-related," the lieutenant said, placing the report neatly on a stack labeled non-critical. "Command will review it." His tone made it clear that meant never. Hours later, when we returned to check, the page was gone. The stack had been cleared, the waste bin empty. The sergeant asked where the reports were sent. The duty officer looked confused, said he hadn't received anything from us. For a moment, I thought our sergeant might hit him. Instead, he just nodded, turned, and walked out into the cold without a word. That night, we sat outside our hut, watching the snow drift across the floodlights. The light created a bubble of safety that none of us trusted. One of the engineers asked what we all were thinking. If it isn't human, why does it take only one at a time? No one answered. The sergeant kept staring into the dark beyond the lights. "Because it's learning," he said finally. "And because it can." The next morning, our photographs, gear logs, and written notes were missing. The evidence locker had been checked overnight by someone without clearance. The duty roster showed no name. The lieutenant insisted the lock had malfunctioned. He smiled too much when he said it. We were assigned to a new sector that day, far from the ridge. On paper, it was to give us rest. In truth, it felt like exile. Rumors started spreading among the other units. They said we had lost men to an avalanche, or that someone had fired on friendlies. The truth, whatever it was, had been rewritten before our boots even hit the new snow. I confronted the sergeant about it that night. He listened without interrupting, then said something I still can't shake. "The mountain belongs to them," he whispered. "We're guests here. Bad ones." He told me not to talk about what we'd seen, not to mention the missing men again, and especially not to look for the reports. You can't lose what they've already decided never existed. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I went outside for air. The wind had returned, slow and steady. At the far edge of the compound, where the lights didn't reach, something moved. I couldn't see its shape, only the reflection, 2 small glimmers low to the ground, watching. I stared back until they blinked out, swallowed by the dark. By morning, new snow covered everything. The officers announced training would resume as usual. Routine replaced reason. Still, I kept thinking about that empty space on the lieutenant's desk where the report had been, about how quickly paper could vanish and how silence could make truth disappear faster than any fart. By the time I came back to Bridgeport, winter had begun to loosen its grip, but the mountains still breathed cold. The snow that remained glittered under sunlight, a deceptive beauty that made it hard to believe what had happened here months before. I told the duty clerk I was picking up old records for engineering analysis. It was only half a lie. What I really wanted was to find proof, something that could hold shape under light and logic. Something that said we hadn't all gone mad. The base looked smaller than I remembered. Quieter, too. A new group of trainees occupied the lower camp, loud and restless, unaware of the things that had crawled these slopes. They choked as they unpacked their gear, and for a moment, I envied them their ignorance. Then I caught sight of the ridge above the landing zone, the same ridge where we had lost 2 men. The wind shifted, and all that envy turned to ash. I borrowed a thermal camera from the supply shed, one used for wildlife studies. Its lens was scratched, but it still worked. I waited until dusk, then began climbing toward the old site. The path was familiar. Every bend carried ghosts. The trees thinned near the top, opening to the same flat where our tarps once stood. Time had erased most signs of us, but the tree at the center still bore faint grooves where we had tied our ropes. I set the camera on a tripod and pointed it toward the rock face. Hours passed. The temperature dropped. My breath fogged the lens. The screen showed nothing but the slow shift of wind and shadow. I almost packed up when something flickered in the corner of the frame. A thin streak of heat. Vertical. Motionless. I adjusted the focus. The image resolved into a shape, tall and narrow, standing halfway up the cliff. The outline pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. I hit record. The figure moved. Not toward me, not away. Just a subtle sway, as if the cold itself were breathing. Then it crouched. The heat signature flared briefly before vanishing. I replayed the footage. For 5 frames, the shape was clear enough to see the curve of shoulders, the stretch of limbs. Then the screen went black. A second later, the camera died. I checked the batteries, still full. The device refused to power back on. I carried it down the slope, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to run. At base, I handed it to the tech sergeant and told him it had malfunctioned. He shrugged and said they'd check it in the morning. When I returned the next day, the camera was gone. No record of its serial number remained in the logbook. That evening, the officer of the day summoned me to his tent. He said command had reviewed my request to revisit the upper ridge and that it was now restricted due to safety concerns. His tone was careful, rehearsed. "It's better to let the past stay buried," he said, smiling without warmth. He told me I'd be reassigned to a coastal facility within the week. When I left his tent, night had already fallen. The stars were sharp against the dark. I stood at the edge of the compound, staring up at the ridge. For a moment, a flash of pale light flickered among the trees, 2 points, close together, moving slowly, like eyes reflecting moonlight. Then they blinked out. I told myself it was imagination, a trick of fatigue. But when I turned to leave, the radio on my belt hissed softly. Static gave way to a faint whisper. At first it was only noise, then words formed through the interference. "Stay," it said. My name followed, drawn out like breath. I dropped the radio and stepped back. The transmission cut off. The air smelled of snow and copper. Behind me, the ridge loomed silent, waiting. I should have reported the incident, but the thought of explaining it made my stomach twist. No one believed reports. Not anymore. That night, sleep came shallow and restless. In my dreams, the camera played back again. The image of the figure on the cliff grew sharper, frame by frame, until I could see its face. It was mine. When I finally worked up the nerve to tell someone, I chose the wrong man. The battalion commander was a tall, clean officer with a permanent squint that made him look thoughtful even when he wasn't listening. I told him everything, except the parts that made me sound insane. I left out the way the creature moved, the mimicry, the sense that it wanted to understand me. I spoke instead about noises, lights, the smell in the woods. He listened with folded hands and a patient half-smile. When I finished, he asked if I had been drinking. I told him no. He nodded, jotted something on a pad, and said I should schedule time with medical. Altitude can do strange things, he said. I reminded him Wisconsin was not at altitude. He stared through me, as though I hadn't spoken. Then he dismissed me with a handshake too firm to feel sincere. By that afternoon, a memo circulated through the unit. Lieutenant relieved of field duties pending evaluation. The words landed like a verdict. My fellow officers avoided eye contact. Some muttered sympathy. Others laughed under their breath. When I turned in my map and compass, the supply clerk looked nervous, as though I might suddenly shout. I spent the next days confined to paperwork in an empty office that smelled of dust and old coffee. Through the window, the forest stretched beyond the fence line. Quiet and indifferent, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it all. But at night, when the wind picked up, the blinds rattled in a rhythm too deliberate to be random. One evening, I found a plain envelope on my desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with no header, no signature, only 3 typed lines. Cease discussion of unauthorized incidents. Cease communication with external parties. Maintain silence until further instruction. No one admitted to leaving it. When I showed it to the clerk, he looked at it once and handed it back. "You don't want that," he said sourly. "Burn it." I didn't. I folded it and kept it in my pocket like proof that something real had touched me. That night, sleep refused to come. I walked the perimeter of the base, the cold biting through my coat. Out beyond the lights, the forest waited, same as always. I stood by the fence and listened. No birds, no rustle of leaves, only the faint scrape of wood shifting. Then just past the wire, 2 small reflections blinked back at me. Not bright, but steady. I raised my flashlight, but the beam bounced off the fence. The eyes were gone. I turned the light away, and they returned. Whatever it was, it didn't like being seen. I backed away slowly until the glow vanished into the tree line. The next morning, I received my official notice. Medical leave, indefinite, effective immediately. The letter used careful language about stress, exhaustion, and field-related anxiety. I signed it because rereading would only confirm what they already believed. When I left the office, I passed the commander's door. He was on the phone laughing. On his desk, pinned to a corkboard, was a photograph of his last hunting trip. In the background of that photo, near the edge of the woods, was a pale blur that could have been anything or anyone. That evening, I packed my duffel and sat by the bus stop outside the gate. The sun fell behind the forest, turning the trees to silhouettes. Just before the bus arrived, the wind carried a sound across the field, a short, sharp knock, like metal tapping wood. It came 3 times, steady, familiar. I didn't turn to look. When the bus pulled away, I stared out the window until the trees disappeared behind the rise of the road. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a shape keeping pace among them, running low, matching the speed of the bus. Then it dropped to all 4s and vanished into the dark. I told myself it was a trick of light and motion, but deep down I knew the truth. Dismissal doesn't end a haunting. It only removes witnesses. The hum started as static, soft enough to mistake for wind in the cables. At Bridgeport, radios always carried noise feedback from the hills, echoes of transmissions bouncing off ridges. But this sound was different. It pulsed. It breathed. When I leaned closer, I could swear it followed a rhythm, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat recorded through glass. I was in the comms tent late that night. Alani's. My reassignment order still somewhat unsigned on the table. I told myself I wanted one last shift before leaving, something to make the decision feel final. The snow outside was melting in thin streaks, the runoff whispering under the floorboards. The radio console hissed quietly until the pulse began again. I adjusted the dials. The tone grew sharper. Then came a voice not clear, not human in the way words should be, but shaped like speech, broken into fragments. Stay north. Don't look. It faded, replaced by low clicks. I froze, staring at the speaker as if it might breathe. The voice returned once more, clearer this time. It said my name. I stepped back, pulling the headset off. The static continued without the equipment. It filled the tent, settling in my ears like pressure before a storm. When I lifted the flap to look outside, the entire ridge glowed faintly under the moon, a line of pale light running along the snow. For a moment, I thought it was reflection from the antenna array, until I realized the glow was moving slow, like something crawling across the slope. I grabbed the headset again. Tuning wildly, the voice shifted, now layered with others, faint and distant, overlapping in waves. Some were shouting coordinates, others repeating numbers that didn't exist. Through it all ran a steady pattern, an underlying hum that matched the one I'd heard weeks earlier in my dreams. At that same hour, hundreds of miles away, a different man in a different forest stopped on an empty road. The officer from Wisconsin, newly discharged, had been driving home through the cold when his radio caught the same signal. Static first, then a pulse, then a whisper that said his rank, his last name, and a place Bridgeport. He pulled over, hands gripping the steering wheel. The forest around him stood still, each tree etched black against the snow. The voice came again, louder this time. Stakes. The dark safe. The station number on his dashboard began to flicker, cycling through blank frequencies. He turned the knob. Every channel was the same sound. Back in California, my sergeant burst into the tent, drawn by the lights. The radio now screamed with overlapping noise. We could make out fragments of conversation that didn't belong to anyone we knew. Units reporting from fields we had never been assigned to, coordinates from across the continent. Then, beneath it all, a deep groan like wind-bending metal. The tent poles vibrated. The ground trembled once, then went still. When the noise cut off, the silence was absolute. The gauges on the panel all pointed to 0. My sergeant looked at me. "You hear that too?" I nodded. Neither of us said what we both recognized in that last sound. A breath. Not electronic interference, but something alive, pressing against the boundary between the airwaves and us. We shut down the equipment and left without a word. Outside, the ridge had gone dark again. Snow drifted down, erasing the faint prints near the antenna tower prints, too wide for boots, leading away into the trees. Later that night, I replayed the moment in my head. The whisper had not said stay north, as I first thought. It had said they walk north. The distinction kept me awake until dawn. At that same dawn, the officer in Wisconsin sat in his parked car, the engine off, the radio silent. The horizon glowed faintly. In his rearview mirror, for a single heartbeat, 2 reflections blinked from the tree line. Then the glass cracked from the inside. Across distance and static, the frequency had connected us. Whatever haunted Bridgeport had found another voice to echo through. The email came from an address that no longer existed. It was sent at 3 in the morning, time-stamped weeks after the sender was declared missing. I was half awake in the barracks when the alert pinged. At first I thought it was a system error. Then I saw the subject line. For Oscar. The body of the message contained no text, only a single attachment labeled simply, recording, .wav. I hesitated before opening it. The moment I did, static filled the room, followed by a faint hum that built slowly, like a generator spinning to life. Then a voice came through, thin and uneven. It was Hender's. He spoke in short bursts, his breathing shallow. If this reaches you, I'm sorry. It's not what we thought. It's not hunting us. It's looking for something it lost." His tone broke into coughing. "I saw it. It's cold, always cold. But when it gets close, you can feel heat, like breath under your skin." The next words blurred, but one phrase cut clear. "It remembers us." I sat frozen, headphones pressed tight, afraid to miss a syllable. The background noise was not silence. It was movement, slow dragging across snow, the faint clatter of metal gear shifting. Then came a sound I hadn't heard since that night on the ridge, the metallic click of a rifle bolt being drawn back. Henders gasped. "It copies everything. Sound, movement, voice. Don't talk to it, don't look at it. If you do, it learns." The rest dissolved into static. Then, almost too soft to hear, another voice overlapped his. It was mine. "Henders, come back." I tore off the headphones. The file had ended, but the air around me still carried the echo of my own voice. I replayed the clip twice more, trying to convince myself I had misheard. Each time his message, the same pattern of breath. Then my voice calling from somewhere deep inside the noise. By dawn, I brought the recording to the sergeant. He listened once, face unreadable, then said, "Delete it." His tone left no room for argument. I asked if he recognized the sound behind Henders' voice. He looked at me a long moment before answering. "That's the sound of someone who's already dead." He walked out of the tent, leaving the player on the table. I deleted the file, or at least I thought I did. Hours later, when I powered the device back on, the memory card showed empty. Yet the storage space was still half full. Hidden data. I didn't dig deeper. That night, I dreamed of standing on the ridge again, camera in hand. The landscape pulsed with light like a heartbeat. From the dark, Henders emerged, eyes hollow, but peaceful. He handed me the same recorder. When I took it, the ground under us cracked, revealing a network of tunnels glowing faint blue. The sound rose from below, thousands of voices whispering the same phrase, overlapping into one endless word. Learn. I woke covered in sweat, the room cold as the mountain air. On my desk lay the recorder, the one I had left in the comms tent. I didn't remember bringing it back. The display was dark, but faintly from the speaker came the same hum as before, steady, patient, waiting. Elsewhere that same night, the officer in Wisconsin dreamed of a mountain covered in light. In his dream, men climbed the slopes, carrying radios that pulsed in unison. At the summit, they stood in silence as a figure taller than all of them stepped forward, wearing their uniforms, its face a blur of every man it had ever watched. He woke shouting. The clock beside him blinked 12 again and again, refusing to move. Somewhere in the distance, a faint radio signal hummed, bridging time and distance once more. The archive smelled of dust and machine oil, the kind of scent that clings to secrets. I had learned that most truths in uniform don't vanish. They're buried under enough paperwork that no one bothers to dig. The records room sat beneath the main building, a maze of filing cabinets and dim yellow bulbs that buzzed like insects. I waited until the night shift settled into its routine, then slipped inside with a key I wasn't supposed to have. The walls breathed with the hum of old ventilation. I found the section marked Environmental and Human Adaptation Projects, a label vague enough to hide anything. The drawers groaned as I pulled them open. Most of the folders were routine, reports on high-altitude sickness, frostbite recovery, fatigue studies. Then I found one marked Project Pale Step Decommissioned. The label was hand-typed, the edges browned. My pulse quickened as I flipped through its pages. The first sheet listed participants, volunteers from early cold weather experiments, all Marines, all marked status unaccounted for. One name stopped me. Corporal Lewis Henders. The next document was a medical evaluation. It described tissue changes due to prolonged exposure to an experimental serum designed to enhance oxygen retention in thin air. The side effects section was redacted, black lines filling half the page. Only a few words remained visible: loss of pigmentation, photoreactive epidermis, extreme thermal variance, and finally, heightened mimicry response. I turned another page. There were photographs, grainy, black and white. A body lying on a medical cot, skin bleached and stretched tight. The face was obscured, but the hands were visible, long, narrow, fingers fused by scar tissue. The caption read, Subject 2, Post-transference stage. The date matched the year before our training at Bridgeport. The last entry was brief. Subjects dispersed following containment breach during field simulation. No recovery possible. Termination unnecessary. Environmental incompatibility expected. Someone had scrawled a note in pen across the bottom. Incorrect. Active traces remain near the range perimeter. The handwriting was Yisiki desperate. I closed the file and leaned against the cabinet, the metal cold through my uniform. The thing we feared hadn't come from legend or superstition. It had come from us. We had built it, tested it, abandoned it, and now it had learned to survive on its own. The realization hollowed something inside me. I replaced the folder where I found it and walked back toward the door. As I reached for the light switch, a faint shuffle echoed from the far end of the aisle. I froze. Another sound followed, a drawer sliding open on its own. The fluorescent bulbs flickered. When they steadied, one file lay on the floor in the aisle behind me. I picked it up. The label read, Retrieval Attempts Bridgeport Range. Inside was a single page dated only a few months earlier. It contained one sentence. Visual contact confirmed. Vocal imitation successful. Unit withdrawal advised. At the bottom, an audio waveform was printed on the page like a photograph. The caption beneath it said, Recorded communication. Voice match. Corporal Oscar. 99.7% certainty. I felt the blood drain from my face. My name. My voice. I had never recorded anything near that site. My first instinct was to destroy the paper. But my hands wouldn't move. I placed it back in the folder, slid it into the cabinet, and left the room, locking the door behind me. Outside, the night was still. The mountains stood black against the sky, their ridges glowing faintly in moonlight. As I walked back toward the barracks, the radio on my belt crackled once. No words this time. Only breathing, slow and steady, keeping pace with my own. Somewhere beneath the ground of that mountain, the archive whispered back to itself, a graveyard of names and voices repeating endlessly, waiting for another listener. The motel mirror was cracked at the top corner, a thin white line that split my reflection like a ski. I had been living there since my dismissal, drifting between silence and icy, sleeping little, watching the trees outside the window. Wisconsin winters always made me feel half-buried, but this year, the cold had a different weight. It pressed against the glass, like a living thing. That night, I dreamed I was back in the forest. The moon was gone, replaced by a pale glow that came from the snow itself. I could hear radios whispering all around, their static merging into something almost musical. When I looked down, my hands were coated in frost, the veins beneath faintly blue. I turned them over and saw symbols carved into the skin lines, spirals, coordinates. They pulsed with light every time I breathed. A shadow moved between the trees. It was tall, thin, walking upright, but its gait was wrong, too fluid. I tried to speak, but my voice came out layered. Two tones at was, mine and another, deeper, hollow. The shadow stopped. Then it raised its hand in the same motion I made. Perfect mimicry. I woke with a jolt, heart hammering. The mirror across the room caught my reflection, but it wasn't mine alone. For half a second, Another face overlapped a pale outline, eyes wide, skin stretched thin. It blinked in perfect rhythm with me. I threw a blanket over the mirror and sat in the dark until dawn. In the morning, condensation had gathered under the cloth. When I pulled it away, the glass was fogged from the inside, as if someone had breathed against it. The pattern of moisture formed 5 lines, splayed like fingers. I packed my bag without breakfast. On the drive out of town, the radio came alive again. Static first, then a pulse. I turned the dial, but every station carried the same sound. It wasn't words, not yet, just the cadence of breathing, rising and falling in time with my own. When I shut the radio off, the sound didn't stop. It came from the air itself, vibrating through the metal of the car. I pulled over near the edge of a frozen lake. The surface stretched white and still under a sky the color of steel. I stepped onto the ice, half expecting it to crack. But it held. In the distance, a figure stood near the center, facing away. I called out, but the echo returned warped, 2 voices overlapping again. The figure turned. It was wearing my uniform. My name tape glowed faintly in the dim light. Its face was wrong, too smooth, like wax poured and molded in haste. I stepped back. The ice groaned beneath my boots. The figure began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, its footsteps silent, though the ice should have screamed under its weight. I ran, slipping once before reaching the shore. When I turned, the lake was empty again. My reflection in the ice stared back, mouth open, breathing slow. I drove until nightfall, not caring where the road led. When I stopped for gas hours later, the attendant looked at me strangely. "You're bleeding," he said, pointing at my hand. I looked down. Thin lines ran across my palm, shallow but precise, forming the same spirals I had seen in the dream. I wrapped it in a towel and said nothing. That night in another motel, I set the mirror facing the wall. Sleep found me quickly, but it wasn't rest. I dreamed of mountains this time, snowless, dry, humming with heat. Voices rose from beneath the soil, repeating a phrase in unison. "We remember you." The sound grew until it became light, and the light took shape, forming silhouettes that moved like men, but had no faces. When I woke, the blanket I'd used to cover the mirror lay on the floor. The reflection showed an empty room, but faintly across the glass, words had appeared where the fog had dried. "Bridgeport calling." I stared until the message faded. Somewhere across the continent, the same whisper echoed through another man's radio. The signal had found both of us again, and I understood now that it didn't need towers or wires. It only needed memory. The envelope had no return address. Its paper was soft from moisture, edges frayed as though carried through weather. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, blocky. All capital letters, the way Henders wrote when filling out reports. I stared at it for nearly an hour before opening it, half certain it would crumble in my hands. Inside was a single sheet, lined, written in pencil. The first lines were ordinary enough, a date that didn't exist, a place called Range 9 that had been decommissioned years before. The words below trembled across the page. "Oscar," it began. "I don't know how long it's been. The clocks here don't move right. Days fold into themselves. We built something that was meant to survive where we couldn't, but it learned faster than we did. I think it was meant to advise, not to forget. Now it carries every voice it ever heard." The next lines grew darker. The pencil pressed hard enough to tear the page. "When you hear it, you'll think it's someone you love. It copies the sound of safety. Don't answer. Every time we speak, it listens, and every word teaches it more." I read those sentences until they blurred. My throat tightened. Hender's handwriting faltered near the end, as though his hand had shaken uncontrollably. "It's not angry, it's lonely. It wants to be us again. If you see it, don't shoot. Just remember me." There was no signature, only a faint mark at the bottom corner, a print that looked too long, almost skeletal. I folded the letter back into the envelope and placed it in my chest pocket. The air in the room felt heavier, as if the words themselves had weight. When I turned on the radio out of habit, static filled the space, then a sound faint, rhythmic tapping, the same pattern Henders used when signaling during field drills. 3 short, 1 long. I whispered his name without meaning to. The static deepened, pulsing once like a heartbeat. Then a voice emerged, soft and close, repeating my whisper exactly. The same inflection, the same breath. For a moment, I felt relief, as if he really had found a way back. Then the voice changed. It began repeating itself faster, syllables folding, words losing shape until it no longer sounded like language at all. The radio cut to silence. I sat still, afraid that any movement might make the air shift again. Outside the barracks, wind rolled through the valley, carrying the smell of wet earth and metal. Somewhere out there, snow melted in slow streams, uncovering whatever the mountain had kept frozen. The next morning, I brought the letter to my sergeant. He refused to touch it. "You keep that," he said. "Some things don't want to be believed." He told me about a file he'd once seen years earlier. During an inspection, reports of recovered handwriting samples from soldiers missing in action, all matching the style of men confirmed dead. "They always write to someone they knew," he said quietly. "Always the same message. Remember me." That night, I dreamed again. The sky was black glass, and beneath it, a sea of pale shapes moved like reflections in water. One of them looked up, and its face was Henders. He opened his mouth, but instead of words I heard static, the same rhythm as the radio pulse. When I woke, the letter lay unfolded beside my pillow, the page damp with dew as though carried through fog far away. In another cold room, the officer from Wisconsin stirred from the same dream. On his bedside table lay a scrap of paper written in pencil, the handwriting unfamiliar yet familiar. It bore a single line: "Tell Oscar it remembers." He woke fully then, heart pounding, realizing he didn't know anyone named Oscar. The mountain had gone quiet again. Not empty, never empty, but hushed, like a crowd waiting for the curtain to rise. Snow fell so lightly it seemed to hover instead of land. I had come back alone this time, against orders, carrying only my pack and the letter from Henders. The others had rotated home or transferred out, taking their fear with them. I stayed, not because I was brave, but because leaving meant abandoning the only thing that still connected me to him. The path to the ridge was nearly gone, buried under months of drift. Each step broke through a thin crust, releasing the muffled echo of the ground beneath. At the clearing, the tree where we had hung our tarp still stood, its bark stripped bare by wind and time. I placed the letter at its base, held down by a small stone. It felt like leaving a note at a grave. The radio on my belt whispered, not static this time, but a faint, steady tone. I turned the volume low. The sound deepened into breathing. Somewhere above, a branch creaked. I didn't look up. Instead, I spoke softly, unsure if the words were for Henders, for myself, or for what had become of him. "I'm sorry," I said. "We didn't mean for any of it." The air thickened, pressing close like humidity before rain. The snow around my boots began to melt in perfect circles, steam rising in lazy curls. Then I saw it. Not in the trees, not on the ridge, but reflected in the sheen of ice at my feet. The outline of a man taller than me. Arms too long, head tilted as if listening. Its form shimmered, bending with each breath of wind. I didn't run. I simply knelt and placed my glove on the ground where the reflection waited. For a moment, Heat bled through the ice, warm enough to sting. The reflection mirrored the gesture. It raised one hand as I did, movements slow, precise, like remembering a dance long forgotten. The radio crackled again, and through the static came a voice mind, soft and uncertain. "We're sorry." The echo that followed wasn't exact. It added something at the end, a word stretched thin until it almost wasn't language. "Home." The figure stepped back. The warmth vanished. When I looked up, the ridge was empty except for the soft drift of snow, returning to cover the tracks I'd left. The letter at the base of the tree had disappeared. Only the stone remained, wet and smooth, as though someone had held it a long time. I stood there until dusk turned the snow to gray. Every instinct told me to go, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving now would break something fragile between us, between what we were and what it had been. As I turned to leave, my radio flared one last time. Not static, the snow had melted into mud and silence. Spring was slow to arrive at Bridgeport, but the air felt different now, less cruel, more watchful. The radio tower had been shut down for maintenance after the strange frequency incidents. I volunteered for the detail. It was the only way I could climb the ridge again without questions. The trail was almost gone, swallowed by erosion. The tree that once held our tarps leaned at an angle, bark stripped bare. The marks I had carved months before were still there, faint grooves beneath the fresh growth. I ran my glove across them, expecting to feel nothing. Instead, the bark was warm. I unpacked what I had brought, a folded tarp, a canteen, and the letter from Henders. Not as an offering exactly, but as acknowledgement. The wind moved softly through the branches. I spoke aloud, the words awkward. "If you remember us, remember what we were trying to do. We wanted to survive. You did." The forest answered in its own language, a shift of air, the creak of wood. Then faintly the same clicking pattern that had come through the radio. 3 short, 1 long. My pulse jumped. I turned slowly, scanning the slope. Nothing moved. Still, the air felt charged like before a storm. I placed the letter at the base of the tree and stepped back. For a moment, I thought I saw frost forming around it, despite the mild air. A pale shape flickered in the corner of my eye. Not close, not threatening. It lingered the way a reflection does before fading. I spoke again. "You can keep it." The wind stilled. Then came the faint sound of movement, something dragging through leaves. A shadow crossed the clearing. My first instinct was to raise my rifle, but I forced my hands to stay still. The shape stopped at the edge of light. It was tall, thin, the pale hue of stone. Its head tilted, the gesture slow and almost human. We stayed that way for what felt like hours. My heart raced, but fear no longer ruled it. The creature stepped closer, enough that I could see the texture of its skin, translucent, stretched like thin ice over moving shapes beneath. It reached one arm forward, stopping inches from the letter. When its hand touched the paper, frost spread from its fingertips. Then it withdrew, leaving the page untouched but glistening. A low hum filled the air, the same tone I'd heard through the recording weeks before. It vibrated through the ground, through me. The creature looked at me then. Its eyes were hollow depressions, yet I felt seen, not threatened, recognized. I whispered, "I'm sorry." The words carried no logic, only instinct. The creature's mouth moved as if trying to mimic the sound. The noise that came out was soft, broken, a fragile echo of my own voice repeating, "Sorry." Then it turned and stepped backward into the tree line, disappearing as quietly as it had come. I stood there long after it was gone. When I finally looked down, the letter was gone too. In its place lay a fragment of cloth dark green, the kind used on old uniforms. Faded across the edge was a name tape. Henders. I took it as gently as I could and folded it into my pocket. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was clear. I started back down the ridge, each step slower than the last, afraid to disturb whatever fragile peace had settled there. At the base of the slope, I turned once more. The tree glowed faintly where the frost had touched it, pulsing with the rhythm of a slow heartbeat. Maybe it was reflection. Maybe not. I didn't need proof anymore. That night, I dreamed of Henders sitting across from me at the mess table, smiling, like before the mountains changed him. He said nothing. He only nodded once, then faded, leaving the faint hum of the radio in his place. When I woke, the hum was still there. It came from outside, low and steady, moving north along the wind. 2 weeks after the incident on the ridge, a new order arrived. The command seal was half smudged, but the meaning was clear. Authorized search and retrieval of unidentified biological presence within the Bridgeport training perimeter. The phrase biological presence did not fool anyone. It was the first time headquarters admitted there was something to retrieve. I was summoned to a briefing room that smelled of old coffee and paper mass. A colonel from intelligence stood at the head of the table, gray hair slicked back, eyes hidden behind tinted glasses even indoors. Beside him, men in civilian clothes flipped through photographs that I was not supposed to see. One image showed the frost-marked tree from the ridge. Another displayed tracks too long and thin for human feet. "You were on site during the original incident," the colonel said. "You'll guide the retrieval team." His tone left no room for refusal. The others didn't look at me. They stared at the photographs, as though memorizing what fear looked like when printed in black and white. We left before dawn. Our convoy wound up the same frozen road I had walked months earlier. Snow drifted in small spirals, whispering against the tires. The soldiers with me were young, fresh, unaware of what their orders really meant. They carried sensors, tranquilizer rifles, cameras that fed into a humming control unit. The equipment looked expensive, fragile, doomed. At the base of the ridge, the colonel gave his speech about containment, about evidence and protocol. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly when he lit a cigarette. I recognized the look in his eyes, the quiet hope that procedure could replace faith. We climbed in formation, spacing even, lights dim. The air grew thin, the temperature dropping with each step. When we reached the clearing, the sensors began to click softly, one by one, as though responding to invisible movement. The radio crackled with bursts of static. Then a voice came through, distorted, faint. It spoke my name. The operator frowned. "Signals local," he said. "Range less than 50 yards. The colonel ordered everyone to hold. The clicking intensified until it became a steady tone. Then the first light flickered out. The forest dimmed around us. Something moved in the haze ahead, tall, slow fall, basil. The men raised their weapons, but the colonel shouted to stand down. The shape stopped at the edge of the clearing. For a long time, none of us breathed. Then it extended one arm and placed something on the ground between us. The sensors went silent. The colonel gestured for me to step forward. I wanted to refuse, but the weight of all those eyes behind me pushed me on. I approached the object. It was a metal tag, the kind worn by Marines, its surface etched with frost. The name stamped across it was Lewis Henders. When I picked it up, the radio screamed. Static filled the air, 1,000 voices layered into one. Men shouted, lights flared. Then everything went white. I woke hours later in the medical tent at the lower base. My ears rang. The colonel sat beside my cot, pale and silent. "We're shutting the site down," he said. "No more exercises. Nothing happened here." I asked about the others. He didn't answer. Outside I saw trucks rolling out, their cargo covered under tarps. Through a tear in one sheet, something pale gleamed under the floodlight, still and fragile, like ice shaped into a body. The colonel noticed me looking. "Don't," he said quietly. "You've seen enough." Before I left, I handed him the tag. He refused to take it. "Keep it," he said. "Someone has to remember." That night, the mountains were silent again. Snow began to fall, erasing the tire tracks, sealing the ground as though nothing had ever been disturbed. I held the tag until my hand went numb. Beneath the surface of the metal, faint warmth pulsed like a heartbeat. In the dark, a low hum rose from the ridge, steady, unbroken, spreading north through the valleys, a signal without end. The footage arrived 2 nights later through an encrypted channel, delivered by a technician who refused to give his name. "You didn't get this from me," he said, placing a hard drive on my desk. "Watch it once, then destroy it." He left before I could speak. The casing was cold, damp with condensation. I waited until the barracks emptied for lights out before plugging it in. The drive contained a single folder labeled Range Surveillance Operation Frost Veil. Inside were 5 video files. 4 were time-stamped sequentially, the last simply titled Unknown. I clicked the first. Grainy night vision filled the screen, rows of soldiers advancing through snow, their infrared outlines glowing white. They moved in silence until static washed across the image. The frame jumped, then stabilized. A tall figure appeared at the edge, shape distorted by the lens. The camera operator panned toward it, muttering something inaudible. The figure's heat signature flared, bright as flame, then vanished. The second file opened on chaosman shouting, lights cutting through fog. A hand blocked the lens, gloved and shaking. The voice of the colonel echoed, distant, commanding retreat. The camera tilted, catching a blur of motion behind the trees, limbs too long, moving wrong. The feed cut out. The third began inside a tent. The camera was set on a crate, recording the colonel leaning over a table, whispering into a radio. Behind him, the tarp shifted, pushed from outside. The movement was slow, rhythmic, like breathing. He froze, eyes wide, then turned off the light. The frame went black. I hesitated before opening the fourth. The image showed the clearing where I had found the tag. Snow fell sideways under strong wind. The lens jerked, catching a flash of white crossing the field. Then the audio spiked static, and something beneath it, a layered chorus that sounded like dozens of voices speaking my name. The camera tilted up. On the ridge above, a single shape crouched, watching. I almost stopped there, but curiosity overpowered fear. I clicked the final file. For a moment, nothing but darkness. Then the camera flickered, focusing on what seemed to be the inside of a transport truck. A tarp flapped in the wind. The camera moved closer, gloved hands pulling the fabric aside. What lay beneath wasn't a body. It was a mirror of one skin like glass, veins faintly lit from within, face half-formed. Its mouth opened slightly, and the sound that came out wasn't a growl or a cry. It was a recording. My voice. "Don't look at it." The words repeated, warped each time until they became unrecognizable noise. The hands dropped the camera. The feed shook, pointing upward. A second figure leaned over the first, identical in shape, identical in face. Both turned toward the lens. The screen filled with white light and static, then cut off. I sat frozen, the hum of the hard drive filling the room. My reflection in the monitor looked vaguely unfamiliar. I ejected the drive, intending to destroy it, but a new folder appeared on my desktop before I could. It bore no name, only an icon shaped like an eye. I tried deleting it, but the system refused. The screen flickered once, twice, then displayed a frozen frame, the last from the video, me mirrored face staring back. The monitor turned black. Across the surface, faint letters began to form, drawn by condensation. "Still learning." I unplugged the system and carried it outside, leaving it on the steps of the empty mess hall. By morning, it was gone. Only a patch of frost remained, shaped like a handprint, fingers spread too far apart. That night, I dreamed of the transport truck again, but this time the tarp was gone. The figure inside was awake. When it opened its eyes, I saw my own reflected there, blinking in perfect rhythm. When I woke, the base power was down. Every screen in the control room displayed the same image, the ridge under moonlight, empty except for one glowing outline moving north. The envelope had no markings, except a faint government seal half erased by smudged ink. It appeared on my bunk one morning, tucked beneath my folded blanket. No one admitted leaving it. The paper inside smelled faintly of ozone and oil, like machinery that had overheated. Across the top, the heading read After Action Review. Operation Frost Veil, amended. Half the text was blacked out. The remaining lines painted a picture colder than the mountain itself. Incident resulted in 4 personnel unaccounted for. Remaining subjects extracted. Biological sample recovered. Contained. Status unverified. Each sentence carried the weight of finality, as if written to close a wound rather than heal it. Further down, a note typed in smaller font read, Audio anomalies persist post-retrieval. Personnel report hearing names transmitted through inactive channels. Recommend auditory quarantine protocols until further study. Someone had circled that line in red pencil. The final page bore a signature I recognized, the colonel from the recovery mission. Next to it, another hand had written in ink, Termination confirmed. Subject stable. Observation ongoing. It was dated 2 days after the colonel's reported death in a helicopter accident. I folded the paper slowly, my hands shaking. Around me, the barracks hummed faintly, though no generators were running. When I pressed my ear to the wall, I could hear it. A low vibration, pulsing like a faraway heartbeat. I told myself it was plumbing, old pipes shifting with temperature, but deep down, I knew it was the same hum from the ridge. That night, a man from intelligence visited. He wore civilian clothes, but carried himself like command. He didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "You've seen the wrong file." I asked what he meant. He smiled thinly. That wasn't a report. It was a recording. He tapped his temple. They put it in paper now, easier to move. He took the envelope from my hand before I could stop him and slipped it into his coat. "You'll be reassigned soon," he said. "North. Don't refuse." His voice was calm, almost kind, but behind it was exhaustion, the sound of someone who had seen too much. After he left, I checked my locker. The tag with Hender's name was missing. In its place lay another document, a single page, torn from some larger report. It read, Phase 2. Cognitive transmission achieved through written medium. Replication threshold expanding. Maintain silence. I burned the page in a coffee can behind the barracks, watching the flames turn the letters to black dust. But even as it burned, I could hear faint whispers rising with the smoke, my name, repeated over and over until the paper collapsed. The next morning, the colonel's office stood empty, his personal effects rethieved. The new officer in charge insisted there had never been a colonel by that name assigned to our base. He said the helicopter crash had been a training simulation. When I mentioned the recovery mission, he smiled the way men do when pitying the delusional. Every document, every radio log, every photograph from that week was gone. In its place were blank folders labeled declassified. The absence itself had become a wall of secrecy. Yet the hum in the walls persisted, faint and rhythmic, as if the silence were learning to speak. That night, I wrote everything I remembered on a single sheet of paper, folded it, and sealed it in my pocket. I didn't know who I was writing for, maybe for Henders, maybe for the thing that wore his shape. The words felt heavier than ink, When I finished, I turned off the lights. From the darkness came a whisper, not from the radio, not from memory, but from the paper itself, the fibers vibrating softly against my leg. The voice spoke only one sentence, calm and certain. "You are writing us." I didn't sleep after that. I understood the experiment was still alive, and now the medium wasn't blood, or it was language. Every word written, every silence kept, another cell in its growing body. The weather warnings came first, cold front moving fast, winds strong enough to bend trees flat. Fort McCoy had seen worse, but the tone in the meteorologist's voice on the radio carried something else, a tremor that didn't belong to science. He said the storm would arrive after midnight, sweeping east across the forested training grounds. I felt it long before it came, a pressure building behind my eyes, like a pulse waiting to break. I should have been far from that place, but some part of me knew the hum was calling again. The discharge papers hadn't stopped the signal. It followed through walls, through distance, through whatever thin barrier separates the living from what remembers them. That night, I drove north under skies heavy with static, headlights cutting through curtains of sleet. The forest loomed black on both sides of the road, motionless and waiting. When the first flash of lightning split the sky, the world turned white. For a heartbeat, I saw everything: the training range, the hills beyond, the old observation tower that hadn't been used in years. Then the darkness fell heavier than before. The car radio flickered to life without my touch. Static first, then the same rhythm I had learned to dread. 3 short, 1 long. The pulse that once came from a creature now came from the sky itself. I left the car on the roadside and followed the sound on foot, boots sinking into mud. The storm roared above, but under it was another noise, a deep vibration that traveled through the ground. Every flash of lightning showed fragments of the world, as if caught between frames. Trees bending backward, branches snapping, shadows darting just beyond sight. The observation tower rose out of the mist like a skeleton of rust. Its top platform swayed in the wind, cables humming in tune with the storm. I climbed, rain stinging my face, each rung slick beneath my gloves. Halfway up, I stopped. Something moved along the tree line below, a pale figure walking against the wind, slow and steady, its limbs whipping like cloth, but never losing balance. At the top, the metal floor vibrated with the force of thunder. I set the radio I'd brought on the railing and turned it on. It hissed, then settled into a low tone. The same hum that had haunted Bridgeport filled the air, merging with the wind until it was impossible to tell where nature ended and memory began. Lightning struck nearby, blinding. When vision returned, the figure was at the base of the tower. It looked up. Even through the downpour, I could see its skin glowing faintly blue, like moonlight caught under ice. My hand went to my sidearm, but didn't draw. Instead, I shouted over the storm, "What do you want from us?" The answer came, not as sound, but as vibration. The metal under my boots thrummed, shaping the rhythm of speech. To be remembered. The words weren't spoken, they were felt. I leaned over the railing, rain running down my neck. "Henders," I said, though I knew the truth was larger than any one name. The figure raised its hand, palm open. In it, something gleamed, a metal tag, shining despite the dark. My tag. I didn't remember losing it. The wind howled louder, shaking the tower. I took a step back as the lights on the radio flared bright red. Through the speakers came a chorus of voices, layered and distorted. Mine, Henders, the sergeants, even the colonels. They spoke in unison. We never left. The figure began to climb. Each movement was fluid, wrong, too fast. I grabbed the radio and slammed it against the railing. But the hum didn't stop. The storm fed it, amplifying until the air itself vibrated. The tower groaned, bolts snapping in protest. I didn't wait to see it reach the top. I climbed down into the stormy slipping, falling, hitting mud hard. When I looked back, lightning struck the tower again. The structure split in two, collapsing in a shower of sparks. For a moment, everything was light. Through it, I saw dozens of shapes rising from the forest floor thin, tall, their outlines glowing faint blue, walking toward the wreckage like mourners gathering for a funeral. The rain swallowed them as quickly as they appeared. The hum faded, replaced by the ordinary sound of wind through broken trees. I stood alone, soaked, shaking, unsure if anything I'd seen had been real. Yet in my pocket, something heavy pressed against the fabric. When I reached inside, my fingers touched metal my tag, warm as blood. I looked toward the hills. The sky there pulsed once more, a soft blue heartbeat moving north. Whatever had been buried at Bridgeport was walking again. When dawn came after the storm, the forest looked as though it had been washed clean of the world. Branches lay twisted in heaps. The ground shimmered with frost, though the air was warm and silence blanketed everything. I wandered through the wreckage, boots sinking into mud that reflected the pale light. Each step left a perfect print that filled instantly with water. At first I thought I was away. Then I saw movement. On the far ridge, an entire column of figures, walking single file along the horizon. The morning mist blurred them, turning bodies into shadows. But their rhythm was unmistakable. Left foot, right, pause, turn. The same cadence drilled into me through years of formation marches. I realized with a slow chill that every motion matched mine exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I raised my arm, they did too. A field of silent mirrors. I lifted my radio. Though it was dead, the static returned anyway, faint, like breath against gauze. The whisper that followed was mine, repeating every word half a second late. I asked who they were. The answer came back in my own tone, but layered with others, hundreds of overlapping voices forming one chorus. We remember. Across the ridge, the figures began to descend. They moved with the smooth precision of soldiers under command, their pale limbs cutting through fog. I felt no fear, only a deep pull, as if the air itself wanted to balance the distance between us. My body swayed forward. Somewhere inside, a part of me knew that to move was to join them, yet standing still felt impossible. A gust of wind tore through the valley, carrying faint echoes of radio chatter numbers, names, coordinates that belonged to men long gone. Each word hit like a memory waking inside my bones. I fell to my knees, hands pressed to the earth that hummed beneath my palms. The ground vibrated with that same frequency, steady and warm. Then I saw him among the marchers. Henders. His outline clearer than the rest, uniform intact, head tilted slightly as if listening for my next command. I shouted his name. He stopped, raising his arm in salute. The others followed, a forest of mirrored gestures. The sight broke something open inside me. All at once, the fear, the guilt, the exhaustion collapsed into something else: recognition. I stood and returned the salute. For a heartbeat, the air between us shimmered. The valley filled with light, faint and blue, pulsing like a living thing. The figures flickered, their shapes dissolving into thin bands of brightness that rippled across the snow. Each beam stretched north, merging into one vast current that climbed the sky. The hum grew so loud it drowned thought. I could feel it passing through my chest, rewriting the rhythm of my heart to match its pulse. The world blurred. The ridge, the forest, even the sky seemed to tilt. When it settled again, the column was gone. Only the footprints remained, hundreds of them, all identical to mine. I took one hesitant step forward. The mud swallowed the print immediately, leaving no trace. I felt lightheaded, as if part of me had been left behind with every mirrored stride. On instinct, I looked into the reflection pooled at my feet. A face stared back, pale and thin, its eyes hollow, yet calm. My own. It smiled once, faintly, and whispered, "March." The sound came not through ears but through marrow. My legs moved before I could stop them. Left, right, pause, turn. The echo followed across the valley. The footprints filled again, each pulse aligning with the hum in the distance. I realized then that the creature had never chased us. It had only been trying to walk beside us, to remember the pattern of being human. When the sun broke through the clouds, the light turned everything white. The hum receded, soft and steady, like waves retreating from shore. I stood alone once more, breath fogging the air, unsure if the march had ended or merely paused. Behind me, the forest creaked. The wind carried a faint rhythm, the same cadence as footsteps fading north. The first report came from a communications relay in Nevada. Operators claimed to hear foreign chatter bleeding into military frequencies. Nothing clear, just syllables and breath. Within hours, every relay on the western coast experienced the same interference. At first, analysts blamed solar flares. Then someone noticed the pattern hidden in the static, a sequence of short and long pulses repeating like code. The translation, when slowed and mapped against Morse intervals, spelled one word over and over: remember. I heard it myself that evening through a small handheld transceiver, left over from my time in Bridgeport. I hadn't turned it on in weeks. When I did, the noise filled the room instantly, deeper than before, layered with underscenes that almost formed words. I set it on the desk and watched the signal strength climb without an antenna attached. The sound seemed to breathe, rising and falling in time with my own. At that same moment, hundreds of miles away, the officer from Wisconsin sat in his truck, on the edge of a field, his dashboard radio tuned to nothing. The same hum rolled through his speakers. He turned the knob slowly. Every channel carried it. The air outside shimmered faintly, as if the frequency itself had taken shape. I began recording. The tape spun, capturing minutes of uninterrupted tone until faintly, a voice threaded through, mine, speaking words I hadn't said. "We are transmission now." The phrase repeated, changing inflection each time, as though learning how to sound human. My hands shook. I unplugged the power, but the speaker continued to whisper. Across the country, power grids flickered. Civilian stations cut to emergency tones that never ended. Every broadcast carried echoes of the same pulse, beneath music and speech. The phenomenon moved faster than any signal should, leaping across networks, jumping through air like a living current. The military labeled it Echo Event. Command locked down all external communications. But silence didn't stop it. The hum seeped through walls, vibrating glass, rattling water glasses on tables. It didn't need transmission towers anymore. It had found new conduits, the minds that had heard it once. I dreamed in static. I saw Henders walking through fog that pulsed with light, his body transparent, his veins glowing with the same faint blue that marked the creatures. He placed his hand on my chest and whispered, "They're speaking through us." Now, I woke gasping, my skin cold to the touch. The officer in Wisconsin dreamed the same dream that night. In his version, he saw me across a valley, both of us standing in the same pale light. When he reached out, our reflections overlapped. The hum became words again, spoken by both our voices. We built memory. Now memory builds us. By morning, the air was alive with signal. Radios screamed. Televisions flickered with blank faces forming out of snow, each one mouthing words that couldn't quite form. Birds fell silent, their calls replaced by faint mechanical clicks. The world had begun to synchronize to the pulse. I packed my gear and climbed the ridge one last time. The snow had melted into pools that mirrored the ski. Each reflection trembled with faint ripples, though the air was still. I knelt and pressed my palm against the surface. A vibration ran up my arm, soft and familiar. Through it came the echo of Hender's voice, layered with countless others. "You called us." We answered. Lightning flashed through the sky was clear. For an instant, I saw silhouettes moving beneath the water, shapes of men and creatures intertwined, their outlines glowing like distant constellations. The pulse quickened, then silence. The transceiver in my pack clicked once. A single phrase emerged, steady and calm. "Transmission complete." I waited for the hum to return. It didn't. The forest lay quiet, almost peaceful. But when I stood, the ground beneath my boots vibrated faintly, a rhythm slow and deep, like the earth itself had learned to breathe. They moved the command post underground after the first wave of outages ceased. The corridors smelled of coolant and stale air. Rows of monitors lined the walls, each one showing a different landscape: snowfields, forests, deserts, all flickering with faint interference. Every feed carried the same undertone, a hum just below hearing. Technicians adjusted frequencies and filters, but the sound always returned, persistent as breath. I had been reassigned there under the title of consultant. Though everyone knew it was containment, they wanted someone who had seen the source, someone who might recognize what was coming. I sat in the far corner of the operations room, headphones clamped tight, listening to recordings that should have been silence. At first the signal seemed random, scattered across channels. Then the analysts noticed a pattern in the interference frames of data, repeating at perfect intervals. When slowed and translated into visual code, the static formed an image: the ridge at Bridgeport under moonlight, empty except for one faint figure standing motionless. Each transmission was identical except for one detail. In every new frame, the figure was closer. I told them to shut it down. They laughed, nervous. "It's just feedback," one said. Yet as the monitors refreshed, the figure advanced another step. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor. The lights flickered once, twice. A young technician swore softly and removed her headset. Blood trickled from her ear. "It said my name," she whispered. Others pulled their headsets off, pale and shaking. The lead analyst ordered a system reboot, but the screens refused to power down. The hum deepened into a tone that seemed to come from inside our skulls. Then the images changed. No longer the ridge now, each monitor showed a different perspective of the room itself. Grainy black and white, as if recorded by invisible cameras. I watched myself on one screen, sitting exactly as I was, eyes wide, staring straight ahead. When I moved, the reflection followed half a second late. Someone cut the main power. The screens went black, but the light didn't leave. A faint blue glow lingered, outlining every person in the room. We stood frozen. The sound dropped to a whisper, a single phrase repeating from every direction. "Still learning." The air shifted, and the glow condensed near the far wall, forming a vertical shape, thin, tall, indistinct. Its edges wavered like heat mirage, but within the blur I saw faces overlapping, changing with each flicker. Hender's, the colonel, the sergeant, and finally my own. I took a step forward, before realizing I was mirroring it exactly. Our movements synced like reflections on glass. The others backed away, silent. The shape tilted its head, studying me. Then it raised one arm and pressed its palm against the wall. A dark mark spread outward from its hand, pulsing faintly. The hum ceased. For a moment, the only sound was our breathing. Then the mark began to glow, revealing text etched into the concrete, not written, but burned into the surface by heat. The words were simple: "Not containment. Continue caution." The lights returned suddenly. The figure was gone. The screens rebooted, displaying normal feeds, no interference. The analyst exhaled shakily, muttering about hardware faults. But the wall still bore the mark, the letters cooling slowly as if from fire. When I returned to my quarters later, I found a headset lying on my bunk. It wasn't mine. The earpieces were wet with condensation. Though instantly used, I lifted it gingerly. Through the faint static came a whisper. Calm, measured, and heartbreakingly familiar. My own voice saying, "Observation ongoing." I dropped it. The hum in the walls resumed instantly, subtle but steady, as though waiting for me to listen again. I didn't. By morning, the surveillance team had been reassigned without explanation. The room was sealed, lights left burning behind locked glass. From the hallway outside, I could still hear the faint rhythm of typing, though the keyboards inside sat unmanned. Whatever watched us no longer needed screens. It had learned the shape of attention itself. The first blackout lasted only minutes. At 2 in the morning, every light across the installation died in the same instant. No surge, no warning. Generators failed, batteries drained as though something had drunk the charge straight from the wires. For a while we stood outside, our flashlights oscillous, listening to the hum of the earth, replacing the usual noise of machines. The stars looked sharper than I had ever seen them, glinting above the mountains like the cold eyes of something awake. Command called it a coincidence, a grid overload. Yet the outage rippled outward across counties, then states, then coastlines. Every hour, another sector went dark. Civilian broadcasts vanished mid-sentence. Airliners grounded. Satellites silenced. The world's map of light collapsed inward, one city at a time, until the planet's night resembled a single breathing shadow. In the absence of power, we began to hear the world again. Real sound wind through metal, water dripping, human voices unfiltered by speakers. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. Even in that natural silence, a new tone lingered, faint and steady. The same one I had carried in my chest since Bridgeport. Each heartbeat echoed with it, as if the frequency had become a second pulse. For 3 days, we functioned on emergency rations and habit. No orders arrived, no communications left. Men spoke in whispers. At night, faint blue glows appeared on the ridge, columns of light, rising from the snow like searchbeams pointing the wrong way, downward instead of up. Through binoculars, they looked like silhouettes, walking inside shafts of illumination. Dozens of them, moving north. The sergeant from my old unit found me. On the 3rd night, his face gaunt, but calm. "It's spreading," he said. "There are not signals anymore. There are paths." He told me that some of the men who had heard the hum the longest had begun walking toward those lights without orders. None had returned. We agreed to watch the valley until dawn. Around 4, the horizon flashed white as if the sun had risen early. A sound followed, low and deep, shaking the snow from trees. The glow faded, revealing the forest floor covered in faint footprints, bare, elongated, overlapping, until they formed a single trail leading north. The hum that came after was almost soothing, like distant thunder rolling in rhythm with breath. By the 5th day, our instruments flickered back to life. Screens glowed pale, but displayed no data. Only a single message across every monitor. System learned. Below it, a progress bar crawled to completion. When it reached the end, the lights cut again, plunging us into silence. That evening, the officer from Wisconsin arrived on foot, uniform torn, eyes hollow. He said nothing at first, just sat across from me, breathing hard. "You heard it too," he said finally. I nodded. He stared into the darkness outside the tent. "It's not killing power," he whispered. "It's keeping it, saving it for something." We stayed awake together that night, listening. The wind carried fragments of voices, laughter, commands, radio calls, all mixed into the hum. Each sound came from the direction of the northern trail. I felt the pull again, the same urge that had driven soldiers and shadows alike. The officer clenched his fists. If it wants us there, maybe that's where this ends. When dawn came, he was gone. His footprints joined the trail outside the perimeter, each step spaced perfectly, measured as if following cadence. That day, light never fully returned. The world stayed dim, caught between night and morning. In the stillness, I realized the blackout wasn't absence, it was correction. The lights we had built had only ever imitated the glow that lived beneath the earth, waiting for us to listen. From the ridge, faint flashes continued to rise and fall, slow and endless, like a code written directly into the horizon. I found myself whispering in time with it. Not words, just the rhythm. Each breath matched the pulse, and for the first time, the hum intensified. We left the base at first light, though light no longer meant what it used to. The sky glowed the color of bruised steel, and the air hummed with a faint electrical feisty. No orders were given. No one told us to move. Yet every surviving man from Bridgeport and Fort McKee rose at the same hour and faced the same direction north. It wasn't command. It was instinct. We followed the old forest road until it dissolved into tundra, a wide expanse of snow and ice, unbroken except for the trails already waiting for us. Thousands of prints, each perfect, pressed deep into frost yet untouched by wind. The path shimmered faintly, lined by a soft blue glow that pulsed like a living vein through the earth. As we walked, radios whispered though their batteries were long dead. The static formed faint words, fragments of familiar voices, names, coordinates. The laughter of men we had lost. Once, I heard my own voice calling the cadence of a march. The others fell in step automatically. Boots struck the ice with identical rhythm. The officer from Wisconsin walked beside me, face expressionless, eyes fixed ahead. "Do you feel it?" he asked. I nodded. It wasn't cold anymore. The air was warm, vibrating with low sound that came from beneath our feet. The hum had changed pitch, deeper now, almost gentle. We passed the skeletons of radio towers, their metal frames bent toward the horizon as if bowing. Beyond them, snow gave way to black rock. The blue glow seeped through cracks in the ground, flowing north like a river. Every few miles, we found relics left behind, helmets, rifles, notebooks, all arranged neatly along the path, as if laid down in offering. By the second night, the aurora had returned, pale curtains of light that moved with the same slow rhythm as our steps. Under it, shapes flickered, tall, thin silhouettes walking ahead of us, translucent but solid enough to leave prints that matched ours. They never looked back, yet each time we paused, they did too. I began to lose track of where man ended and echo began. My hands no longer ached from the cold. My breath left no fog. When I looked down at my reflection in the snow, faint light pulsed under my skin. It didn't frighten me. It felt like memory, surfacing through flesh. At dawn, we reached the sea. The ice stretched out to the horizon, a flat mirror reflecting the colorless sky. The hum became thunder, steady and low. Out on the frozen surface, countless figures stood in formation, facing north. They were men, and not men. Uniforms faded, faces smooth, every one of them glowing faint blue. The officer whispered, "They made it." He stepped forward onto the ice. I followed. The surface held vibrating beneath our boots. The line of figures began to move again, slow, deliberate, each step echoing through the air. The sea groaned, but the path held firm. When we drew close, one of the shapes turned toward us. It was Henders. His face was calm, his eyes hollow, but warm with faint light. He lifted a hand in salute. Without thinking, I returned it. Around us, thousands of others did the same. The gesture rippled outward until the horizon itself seemed to bow. The officer spoke quietly. This is what they wanted to go home. His voice cracked, lost between awe and sorrow. The march continued. The sound of it filled the world, a single rhythm rising from ice and air, erasing the boundary between living and remembering. I could feel each step inside my chest, my heart sinking with the pulse beneath the sea. When the aurora reached its peak, the light folded downward, touching the ice. The figures ahead merged into it, dissolving into brilliance. The officer turned to me one last time. If we disappear, let them know it wasn't fear, he said. It was gravity. He stepped forward and vanished into the light. I followed. The world went silent. For a moment, there was only warmth, as though standing inside the memory of a heartbeat. Then everything faded into white. Far behind, in the empty camps of Bridgeport and Fort McCoy, the radios crackled once, carrying a single phrase across the static. March complete. Rain came to the mountains for the first time in months. It fell steady and warm, washing the last crust of snow from the ridges and carrying the scent of pine and stone down into the valleys. Bridgeport looked ordinary again. Just another forgotten training site, with rusted signs and empty trails. If someone new arrived today, they'd see nothing but weathered barracks and silence. They'd never guess what had walked here, or how close the world had come to remembering itself too clearly. I stayed until dusk. The comms tower still stood, tilting against the sky, its metal ribs glistening with rain. I found a dry corner under its base and unpacked the last piece of equipment I owned, the recorder that had once carried Hender's voice. The batteries were dead, but when I switched it on, a faint light flickered to life. Static filled the speaker, low and familiar, the sound of presence more than absence. I spoke softly, not as soldier to command, but as one voice into another. We finished it. The march ended at the sea. The static answered with a short pulse, gentle as breath. I think they found peace, I said. Maybe they weren't looking for home after all. Maybe they were building one. For a long time, the recorder said nothing. Then the light blinked once. Through the hiss came a whisper, imperfect trembling. Remember. The tone carried no demand, only kindness. I smiled without meaning to. The rain thickened, drumming on the metal. I closed my eyes and listened. Beneath the noise, another rhythm surfaced. Faint but steady, the same pulse that had haunted me through every forest and mountain. Except now, it was slower, calmer. No longer something separate. I realized it had never been outside of me. It was memory, not invasion. The echo of every name we refused to forget. Every breath shared between what was human and what had learned to be. Before leaving, I buried the recorder beneath the tower, wrapping it in the scrap of green fabric that still bore Hender's name. The soil was soft, easy to turn. When I covered it, the static faded, leaving only rain. As night fell, fog rolled down from the ridge, thick and white. In its folds, I thought I saw figures walking, quiet silhouettes, crossing from one side of the valley to the other, unhurried, translucent in the mist. I raised a hand in farewell. They paused for a moment, returning the gesture, then dissolved into the rain. By the time I reached the road, the wind had died. The world felt lighter, as if some enormous breath had finally been released. I looked back once. The ridge glowed faintly, each drop of rain catching the last light of dusk. For an instant, it resembled a horizon made of mirror ski above, reflection below, no line dividing them. I don't know what waits beyond that glow, or if anyone will ever find this account. Maybe it will fade like the hum did. until all that's left is a quiet story soldiers tell to themselves when the field goes dark. But I hope that when they do, they'll understand. It was never about monsters. It was about remembering what we create and what still remembers us in return. The storm passed before midnight. In the final calm, a weak signal returned to every dead radio across the region. It played only once, a voice calm and steady. Recorded long ago. This is Corporal Oscar. Final log. Mission concluded. Everyone home. The broadcast ended. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was complete.